Hello everyone, this is Jonathan Little for PokerNews.com. Today we're playing very deep early in a $10,000 buy-in World Poker Tour event. Here you have Ace-3 offsuit in the big blind facing a min raise from the hijack seat. Then we have a call from the button and a call from the small blind. And, Ace-3 is not a very good hand, but that's okay. I think this is a reasonable spot to call just because we're getting good pot odds. However, I actually don't mind re-raising this early in a tournament if we pick a relatively large size, because this ace-3 is going to play somewhat poorly out of position heads up if we do, or a multi-way if we do just call, because imagine it comes ace-xx and someone bets, we're not loving it. If it comes with a 3, well, we're still not loving it. So this is a spot where I could certainly see re-raising being fine, and I mix it up here. I probably call here 75% of the time and 3-bet some portion of the time, 25% or so. If I am going to 3-bet, like I said, it's going to be large. So a pot size re-raise here is 3 times the last bet, so 300, plus any additional dead money in the pot. So 3 times 300 is 900, plus another 3, that's 12, plus another 3, that's 15. And from out of position, I'm going to make it a little bit more, and maybe, because I'm deeper stacked, I may even make it a little bit more. So I'd like to see something like 18 or 1900 in this spot with my whole range. I go 1700, and I think this is perfectly fine if I am going to be 3-betting, but I would prefer a hair more, given we are very, very deep stacked. If we were shallower, I would like a smaller, slightly smaller 3-bet. Not a lot smaller, like 1700, but given we are deeper, I'd prefer 1900 or so. All right, flop comes Jack 10-4. This is a spot where we have to go ahead and figure out immediately if we're going to be barreling off here or if we're just going to check fold. I actually don't mind a check fold in this spot. This is a board that should be great for my opponent's calling range and just marginal for me. If we are going to bet, I definitely like betting on the smaller side, because when we bet, let's say 2,000 into the 4,000 pot, well, if we steal the pot a third of the time or more, we're going to show an immediate profit. And I would be willing to bet our opponent's not going to call 66% of the time in this scenario with his whole range. And when I go 1,700, that applies even more. Now we need to steal it like 30% of the time. And we certainly will steal it 30% of the time, I imagine. So if we are going to bet, I like a small bet. I don't think if we were to bet between, let's say, 3,000 and 1,500, I don't think that's going to make our opponent fold that much more by betting twice as much. And this often happens in 3-bet pots where typically small bets are going to be ideal, especially if you have any sort of a bluffing range. And also if your range is generally value heavy, as mine typically will be. So anyway, 1,700, I think this is fine, but I also think check folding is okay. It's fine to check fold your worst hands, and this hand certainly is one of my worst hands. All right, turn comes, and it's a king. So this is a card where now, if our opponent had something on the flop, let's say Jack 9 or Ace 10, well, it now got significantly worse. Also, this card should really drill my whole range, because if I was bluffing on the flop, it was probably with a hand like Ace King or Ace Queen, although maybe check calling those hands is ideal. But if I am betting those, clearly the king is great for me, right? If I had aces, kings, queens, jacks, tens, obviously those are all still pretty strong hands that I would consider betting with this size. So this is a great spot for me to continue bluffing. I really was not planning on continuing to bluff in this spot very often on the turn, but if they put a king out there, and maybe even a queen on the turn, I think it's fine to go for it. And I also think it's fine to go ahead and fire out another bet on the river. And my river bet's going to be substantial. If my opponent calls here, the pot's going to be 12,500 or so. I probably would bet 9,000 on the river. I think that's going to have a very large amount of fold equity and make my opponent fold almost all non-2-pair hands. If my opponent, of course, raises, which a lot of people will do with their 2 pairs and sets at this point, that's great because it lets me right off the hook. And again, this turn bet now needs to win 2,500 divided by 7,400 plus 2,500, which is about 25% of the time. So the way you figure it out is you do your bet divided by the current pot plus your bet. So 2,500 divided by 10,000 equals 25% of the time. So will this work 25% of the time? I actually don't know about that. If I had to guess, I'd say it's close. Just because whatever my opponent called with on the flop, very often that's going to have improved to some additional equity on the turn. I'm not saying it necessarily has 2-pair, but if you had a hand like Ace 10 on the flop, well, now if he has an ace, he has a gut shot, right? And getting the good pot odds, I don't think he's ever folding those hands. If he has Jack 9, same story. I mean, a queen's obviously not good, but he's probably going to be roped in based on the great pot odds. But the cool thing about this is that if he calls with all these hands like Ace 10 and Jack 9, he's almost certainly going to fold it to a big river bet. So I don't really care if he sticks around wide on the turn because I already have a plan in mind to fire out on a lot of rivers. Again, I don't think a big bet on the turn makes sense. Notice if I pot it, for example, while that may have a bit more fold equity than this 2,500 bet, if I pot it, we need to steal it 50% of the time. And when I bet this small sizing, we need to steal it 25% of the time. So does potting it make 25% of our opponent's range fold? And I mean, it's probably close when you start talking about potting it or over potting it. Actually, let's talk about that. Could I instead bet something like 12,000 on the turn? I think that would be a pretty sweet bet. That bet needs to work 12,000 divided by a total of 20,000. So that would be about 60% of the time. So will our opponent call with 40% of hands that he gets here with whenever I over pot it for 1 point something X the pot? That's close. I actually don't know if that's the case. You will see a lot of the best players overbetting the turn, primarily when their range is a lot of nut hands, which mine certainly is here, or when it's bluffs, which clearly I have a bluff here, so I could have some bluffs. Ideally, you want to be making the overbets on the turn, though, when your draws actually have a lot of equity. And my draw here doesn't really have that. So maybe I would want to be overbetting in this spot with hands like ace-5 of spades if I had that, although I'd probably just call that pre-flop. And looking at this board, there really aren't very many bluffs that make a lot of sense to overbet bluff, but I would not hate it. So if I am overbetting here as a polarized strategy, or as a balanced strategy, I would also have to overbet here with top sets, middle sets, bottom sets, two pairs, etc., just to really put my opponent in a miserable spot. And with those hands, I think especially against random older guys in a WPT event, I would much prefer to just bet small and continue extracting value. So you always, if you're going to be using overbets versus generic random opponents, you want to know what you are inducing. Whereas if you're doing it against strong players, you just want to have a good understanding of what your range looks like and make sure you are at least somewhat balanced. But a quite strong play against a lot of amateur players is to make whatever play you think is going to lead to the best result for you. And I would venture to say that here, the small bet on the turn plus the big bet on the river is going to be very nice. I do also think, though, if I was to make an overbet here, it would be entirely as a bluff. I would not do it for value at all versus a generic older guy. So anyway, 2,500 on the turn. Oh, well, we just pick it up. We don't even have to fire the river. And, well, this is a good example. I would not expect to have much fold equity at all on the turn, but still, are we going to pick it up 25% of the time? Certainly, right? I mean, it's hard to not steal something 25% of the time. So that's going to be it for this hand for PokerNews.com. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like my hands on Poker News, let the people at Poker News know I work very hard on these, and we've made a lot of them. If you have not watched them all, definitely go back and watch the archives on PokerNews.com. You can also listen and watch my podcast, Weekly Poker Hand, at JonathanLittlePoker.com under the podcast tab, or you can go to JonathanLittlePoker.com/WPH, or you can find it on iTunes. And if you like this, I mean, it's essentially the exact same thing, just it's been going for longer. I think we're about 150 episodes into that, so go check that out. If you enjoy this series for PokerNews.com, you'll certainly enjoy Weekly Poker Hand. Thank you very much for watching, and be sure to check back next week for another fun poker hand.